The very last games to talk about are games that are not Final Fantasy games, but were given the name. These fall into two categories: Square games that were rebranded as Final Fantasy for localization purposes, and non-Squaresoft games related to the Final Fantasy series in small ways. Firstly, let's talk about the Square games. The first one to talk about is a Game Boy game called Warrior in the Tower of the Spirit World Saga. The game is a fairly traditional RPG in which a group of player-selected characters climbed up a massive tower, visiting the various worlds the tower connected to. In the end, they were forced to confront and battle against God himself. The game, as it was made by Squaresoft, contains some similarities to Final Fantasy, mostly in character design, but is otherwise unrelated. Although it's exactly the type of game you figure would not get localized, Square decided to try anyway, and decided to capitalize on the fact that Final Fantasy did sell well in America, and there was fan demand for a sequel, as American gamers were unaware of Final Fantasy II and III at the time. So the game was rebranded as The Final Fantasy Legend, and actually is the second game released in America with the name Final Fantasy. The gamble paid off, and the game sold well. The game started its own series in Japan, and the next two games for the Game Boy were Saga II: The Treasure Legend, and The Ruler of Time and Space: Saga III Final Chapter. They were both also localized and brought to America under the titles Final Fantasy Legend II and Final Fantasy Legend III. Both games also received high praise, particularly II, though sales were not as strong as the original game. Perhaps due to this, although the series continued in Japan, it did not in America. Saga III was the last on Game Boy, but the series continued on the Super NES, or rather the Super Famicom, as they were Japan exclusives, with Romancing Saga, Romancing Saga II, and Romancing Saga III. After this, the series hit PlayStation, and due to the success of Final Fantasy VII, the seventh game, Saga Frontier, was localized, using its original title with no connection to Final Fantasy, and although it received poor reviews, it sold well. The series continued for two more entries, Saga Frontier 2 and Unlimited Saga for PlayStation 2, before being abandoned, but with no connection to Final Fantasy. The last thing to mention is that the first two games, which were branded as Final Fantasy games in America, did receive remakes. The first being on the WonderSwan Color and mobile phones, and the second on the DS, but none of these reached America. If you remember way back in Part 1 of the feature, I gave a brief outline of the early years of Square and the origin of the name Final Fantasy. It was believed to be the company's last game at the time. If you recall, the reason that Square was in such trouble was that most of their money was sunk into an unreleased Famicom Disk System game that was far too ambitious and was never released. Remember the name of the game? Holy Sword Legend: The Emergence of Excalibur. Now, keeping that in mind, Square started working on a Zelda-type RPG for the Game Boy entitled Geminites. Still having the trademark for Holy Sword Legend, Square decided to use it, rebranding Geminites as Holy Sword Legend: Final Fantasy Gaiden. The game featured various references to the Final Fantasy game, such as familiar enemies, Moogles, and even a chocobo to ride on. Upon its localization in America, it was published by Sunsoft, who renamed the game Final Fantasy Adventure, to much success. Interestingly, this brings the total of Final Fantasy games on the Game Boy to 4, none of them actually being Final Fantasy games. And very interestingly, the game was localized to Europe as Mystic Quest, not to be confused with Mystic Quest Legend, which came out later and actually was a Final Fantasy spin-off. Most illogical. The sequel to Holy Sword Legend was on the Super NES, simply Holy Sword Legend 2. This one was similar in themes regarding the Holy Sword and Mana Tree, but removed references to Final Fantasy, letting the game stand on its own. Reflecting this, the game was localized to America as Secret of Mana. The third game would not be localized at all, but all future games would, and would follow the Mana name with no references to Final Fantasy, giving us Legend of Mana, Dawn of Mana, Children of Mana, Friends of Mana, and Heroes of Mana. The original game was later remade twice. First, it was remade for Game Boy Advance as Sword of Mana, overhauling the game to not have any Final Fantasy references. For example, instead of riding a chocobo, the character fires himself over the map using a cannon, like in the rest of the games. The exception to this are Moogles, which still appeared. The game was remade a second time as Holy Sword Legend Final Fantasy Adventure for Japanese mobile phones. Though this did have advanced graphics and was released after Sword of Mana, it had more in common with the original release, retaining all of the Final Fantasy references. Though it is unofficial, Square has hinted that the game may receive yet another remake on the Nintendo DS. Lastly are two games that bear the name Final Fantasy, but are based on the Japanese anime Final Fantasy Unlimited. The first, Final Fantasy Unlimited with You, was released for Japanese mobile phones, and the second, Final Fantasy Unlimited on PC Adventure Labyrinth, was released for Windows. Neither received their localization. Well, I have officially given you as much information as I can cram into this on every single video game to bear the name Final Fantasy, which leaves us with just one more part. Join me next time and we'll talk about the films, television, novels, and other media inspired by Final Fantasy.